everyone! In this video I will be trying to make a pair of 18th century stays as well as talking about some facts I learnt along the way. First, before starting, you might be able to tell that this project will certainly not be historically accurate in terms of the fabric used. And also, I plan on using a sewing machine for the seams and channels, which wasn't yet invented in the 18th century. I just want to make the stays to get a feel of them, and perhaps in the future it will be completely hand sewn. Anyway, let's get started. I used the Making Georgian and Regency Costumes for Women book. It's by Lindsay Holmes, and I got my pattern for the stays I'm making in this video from there. I wanted to make the long stays, and the pattern comes with two versions of the front piece for the stays. One for the earlier 18th century and the other for later. I chose the earlier. The actual pattern only has 4 panels to it: the front, side, back and straps. First, I had to scan the book page onto my computer, and I used paint to scale it up and then printed it out and patched the pieces together. Now, of course, the next thing I did was make a mock-up, because this pattern is approximately a size 12, with the book giving the accurate measurements, and I am definitely not these measurements. The book suggests trying to not adjust the size from the centre front or centre back, so I changed it from the side panel. I decided that the length of the stays were good for me, so at least that didn't have to be changed. I think I had to do about 3 mock-ups before getting annoyed and deciding to move on, but hopefully it is good enough. Next, I moved on to pinning and cutting out the fabric with my altered pattern pieces. This project is a completely thrifted project. I did this so I could use the fabric stashed away in my chest and I wouldn't have to spend anything on the project. I used leftover black couture for the inside of the stays and some red fabric that you will see later, but I have no idea where it came from. I believe it is a polyester satin lining fabric from the feel of it. Unfortunately, I absolutely hate it because it isn't good quality, but I refuse to buy something better, or else it would kind of defeat the purpose of the project. Next, I pinned the panels together and sewed them with a 1 cm seam allowance, and I repeated this process for the other side of the stays and with the other red fabric. Fact 1. Stays are a part of the underpinnings category of historical garments. It serves as the base of the outfit, for the rest of it to be placed on top, giving it the correct silhouette. Fact 2. In the 18th century, other underpinnings include a shift or chemise, and depending on the decade and style of gown, a variety of skirt foundations such as bum roll, hip pads or panniers. Fact 3. Stays are basically just another word for 18th century corsets. Afterwards, I had the awkward job of matching the couture and the polyester together. I lined up the seams of each panel and pinned them together as accurate as possible. It took a few attempts until I was relatively happy with the outcome though. Next, I sewed as close as possible to the seam line to secure the panels of fabric together. I put the red fabric upwards because the fabric is very flimsy and moved easily. This way I could control it better. Also, I used contrasting black thread, so I wanted this side the neatest as it would be seen on the outside when I wear it. I do this to both of the seam lines, and I do it to all the other seams of the stays. Then I marked the fabric with chalk, ready to sew the boning channels. I marked 1 cm away from the black stitch lines near the seams, so there will be 2 boning channels on each side of each seam. Then I sew down the channel lines I marked. Fact 4. The primary purpose of 18th century stays was to raise and shape the breasts, tighten the midriff, support the back, and improve posture to help women stand straight, with the shoulders down and back, and only slightly narrowing the waist, creating a V-shaped upper torso over which the outer garment would be worn. However, jumps of quilted linen were also worn instead of stays for informal situations. I also marked 1.5 cm away from the centre back and centre front. This is so I can factor in the 5mm binding I will be adding later. These boning channels are probably the most important because they will support the eyelets that will be sewn in later. There were also channels marked on the pattern from the book that were in the middle of the side panels and back panel. I think it was for extra support, so I marked these on as well. Fact 5. Stays were often made from wool, linen, twill fabric and silk brocade. The linings were always a stiffened layer, with a more decorative layer on the outside. Then I sewed these channels into the stays. Next, I worked on the straps. Now, I'm not one for following instructions, so I didn't check what it said in the book, and I invented a way of keeping the straps in place. I slotted the straps into the gap between the boning channels in the stays and pinned them in place. Afterwards, I used spare ribbon I had as a way of neatly binding the straps to the stays securely. I hand sewed these in place on both sides of the stays. The task after this was the one I was dreading the most, and for good reason: the binding. I made the bias binding off camera with the help of my mum because I hate the task of making bias binding. I lined up the binding with the edge of the stays and started hand sewing it in place using the back stitch. After the first line of hand sewing, the binding is turned over to the other side of the stays and tucked under to be sewn into place using a whip stitch, so it is less visible. Unfortunately, I do not hand sew very neatly, especially when I am annoyed and bored of a very tedious task, but I think it isn't too bad and it won't be seen as it is on the inside. The tabs of the stays were the hardest because of the sharp angles of them. I had to ease the binding around all the corners, and I sometimes trimmed the corners off so the binding looked neater. Fact 6. Stays were often bound in leather, but the edges were also finished with cross-grain, linen tape, or the fabric used for the stays. Next, I sewed the ends of the boning channels I created because I realised if I put the boning in without sewing the ends, it would fall into the tabs, which I know isn't right. So this was the solution I thought of, though I'm unsure whether this is accurate. Afterwards, it was finally time for the boning to be prepared and put into the channels. First, I measured the channel. I factored in that I needed less because the top would be binded and there needs to be a little room at the top and bottom of the channel so it isn't strained. So I took off about 1.5 centimetres from my measurement before I marked it on the boning, ready to cut, and I cut it with pliers. Then I sanded the sharp corners of the boning down so it doesn't wear down the fabric, especially the low quality red fabric I'm using. Then I pushed the boning down into its designated channel and pushed it further down with my stitch ripper. Although anything else would work, I just need it out the way for when I bind the top of the stays after. I repeated this process for all of the many boning channels. Measure, mark, cut, sand and slide into the channel. Fact 7. Though I'm making my stays out of plastic boning, boning was usually made from whalebone or baleen, reed or wood bents. Next, I moved on to marking the stays for the eyelet holes. I used my pattern as a reference for where the eyelets will go along both the centre front and centre back. I used an awl to push through the fabric to make the hole for the eyelets. Fact 8. Who wore them? The answer is all classes of women wore them. The upper classes, especially royalty and aristocracy, wore more constricting stays. This was achieved by having straps on them and lacing them much tighter. However, lower classes mostly wore strapless stays, so they didn't interfere with the movement of their shoulders while working, and they laced them looser. And don't forget about the eyelet holes on the strap and the front of the bodice, so they'll be able to lace up too. Fact 9. Stay makers were often men, which was usually because the processing of baleen required strength and stamina. Before sewing the eyelets into the stays, I had to make the holes bigger, which I achieved by shoving my scissors through the hole, and it turned out that one of my makeup brushes was the perfect size for the eyelets I wanted. Next, I used one thread of black embroidery floss I had lying about. I threaded it up and began sewing around the hole. I saturated the hole to make sure the thread is thick and strong, as it will be supporting the laces to tighten around the body. I tried to keep the distance around the hole the same, but I found it quite difficult. However, I am quite happy with my first attempt of hand sewing eyelets in place. I continued to sew the eyelets along the centre front and centre back panels of the stays, and I didn't forget about the eyelets of the straps and front panel. I laced them up and I was done. I know this is far from historically accurate, and I'm sure any historical sewers watching this will be cringing at every step I did, but I was aware of what I was doing, and I'm quite happy with my first attempt despite the problems I faced and the mistakes I made. I hope you're enjoying my video. If you want to see me progressing through my projects as I go along, you can visit my Instagram with updates of what I'm doing for my projects before the YouTube videos come out. Thank you for watching. Bye!